Welcome to the podcast MasterClass. And I am just so thrilled that you have taken out time to be a part of this. This podcast MasterClass I put together because of all the messages and emails and even just conversations that I have had with so many of you that have said, I wonder if a podcast might be a good tool for me, or some of you already have a podcast and you're just wanting to maximize its potential and take it to the next level. And so I remember when I started 4 years ago, there was quite a learning curve. And so the intention of this class is anything that we have learned, discovered, and put to use that has gotten us results that we can get to you. That is what I want to do. So thank you so much for joining in today. Most of you are watching this live. I know some are going to be watching this on demand after the fact. Regardless of how you are connecting, I welcome you. Also, I want to let you know that at the end of this session, I have really set aside a chunk of time for some question and answer. So as we're working through the content, if there's things that just spark a question in you, write that down and in the chat feature as you're participating. Obviously, this is for our those that are live streaming. Go ahead and send that question in, and we are going to do our best to get to every single question that's there. Hopefully, that is really going to get you that information that you need. So from here, you can get started. Okay, I want to just give you a couple of things that we are going to be covering in this podcast so that you can be ready. I am going to cover how we put together the podcast from the practical side to the creative side, so that on the other side of this, you have a path forward in both ways, both practically and creatively. Now, I want to tell you right off the bat that most of the practical things that you're going to need, rather than trying to write it down and get everything in your notes, after this class is over, you are going to be getting an email from me with a PDF file attached. And in it is going to be all the practical tools that you need to put a podcast together. I'm talking about links to where you can get the equipment, the microphone, the speakers, all of that will be there. You'll have in there a link to editing platforms. You'll get the links to exactly the programs that we use to edit the podcast. You will get links to where to download intro music, all of those things that you need, how you set up your podcast so people can access it on iTunes, on Spotify, through Google Play, and the exact process that you need to go through to make sure that it's set up right. You're also going to get info in that PDF about how to name your podcast, how to describe it, and even the details involved with that have a big part to play in hitting those iTunes top podcast categories. So that's going to be a big portion, I know, for a lot of you. So be watching for that PDF file, because again, a lot of those practicals and particulars, we wanted to have those available to you in that format so that you weren't just trying to jot down everything as I was saying it. So that's going to be a big help. Couple other things that are going to be on there is the submitting process for your podcast. When you go to submit it to places like iTunes and Google Play, you really have to do it in a specific way because it has to be approved before they make it available. So those are some things that you're really going to want to pay attention to. Okay, I want to have a fun moment together. For those of you that are listeners of my podcast, you know that we like to start out every podcast with having a little fun. And when I have guests on, I like to ask them a few get to know you questions. What's so funny is this just started out with just the first couple of guests. It's just a fun thing to do. But to be honest, it's something that we get a lot of feedback about, that people just enjoy those get to know you moments. And those 3 questions that we ask our guests have actually helped a lot of people. We ask them the same 3 things. First of all, just something fun. What's your go-to favorite Starbucks drink or cup of coffee? Our second question is, what's a product that you're using right now that you're just loving is really helping you? And then the third one we ask is, what's a book that you are reading or have recently read that has just really impacted you? Could be anything, fiction, nonfiction, how to, whatever. And so many of you have said, I have read those books. They've been amazing. I've tried all the Starbucks drinks. Some of those products have been great for me. So I just thought we would start out this podcast masterclass and I would go through and answer those questions just for the fun of it. So our first one is, what is your go-to coffee drink? Right now, obviously, we are all navigating this moment in this sort of quarantine environment. And so Starbucks runs aren't what they used to be. I can tell you that my favorite go-to coffee drink at home is a local place here in Nashville. They roast their own beans. It's called Frothy Monkey. If you follow me on Instagram, you've probably heard me talk about it. But I love to make their coffee at home. And so typically that's what I make in the morning. And I put in a half a cup, or not a cup, a half a packet of stevia and a little bit of cinnamon. That is my favorite cup of coffee in the morning. And then typically my go-to Starbucks drink, or if I'm going to order coffee out, is an iced almond milk latte with just a little bit of honey. It is so good. So some of you need to try that. Okay, what is a favorite product that I'm using right now? I have to tell you, again, in this whole quarantine situation, my favorite products right now are Zoom, which is how we're bringing this masterclass to you today. Zoom has opened up so much potential for so many people. It's opened up access for me and my team to be able to bring you things like the online Ahead of the Curve conference we did last week and this masterclass today. But Zoom is also a way that I've been able to stay in touch with my family that's spread across the country. We've done Zoom calls. Maybe some of you have done that. And then my other favorite product right now is a tech product, and it's Marco Polo. Marco Polo is another great way that you can stay in contact with friends and family. And it's just interesting where usually you would just pick up the phone and make a phone call. I find myself, maybe some of you are experiencing this too, either FaceTiming or video chatting through things like Zoom or Marco Polo. There's just something about staying connected in that way right now. So those are my two favorite products. And then what is a book I'm reading right now? There was actually a book that was just released this month as an ebook. Are you just loving ebooks? I'm loving them. At first I thought, I just love to have the book in my hand and I love the feel of the pages, and that's true. But when you really want to get your hands on a new book release on the quick, these ebooks are so great. The other thing I'm loving about ebooks is that they're typically, it's not War and Peace. It's not going to take you 2 months to read. They're shorter formats. And so it's a great way to just get a word in due season. And so actually an ebook I'm reading right now is by a woman named Dr. Mary Frances Farallo. And she just released an ebook this month called Influencers. And it is such a right on time message for me and my team, and really even what we're walking through right now. It's inspiring. It sparks so much creativity, but it really paints the picture for what the kingdom of God had in mind all along. And it was just really about putting us all in position for influence, but what that actually looks like. So that is awesome. In fact, if you'd like to get that ebook, you can download it. I got it on Amazon.com, or I think you could probably go to Dr. Mary Fran's website, which I think is mfvm.org. Great book. You're going to love it. Okay, we're going to get into our content for this podcast masterclass. And I'm so thrilled to be able to do this with you, to be a part of your journey of helping you find a new tool to begin to create and release and inspire others with what God put on the inside of you. Is just something that has always lit me up on the inside. And so we're going to have a lot of fun. The first thing that I want to get into before we get into the practicalities of podcasting is you have to be able to answer the question, why? And that's really where I started. my why was something like this. God, why with all the books that are already out there, with all the people that are already speaking to so many things, with all the podcasts that are already out there, why would you have me do this? And I just remember that answer just really dawning on my heart. And the answer sounded something like this: because Jen, there's going to be people, in fact, there are people that there's something in them that's going to resonate with the something in you. And even though there might be 10 other people that are saying something similar to what you're saying, they're not going to say it the same way that you say it. And you're not going to say it the exact same way that they say it. And there's people that are going to resonate, that are going to be drawn to how it comes out of you. That's why even in a world, in a sea of podcasts, in a sea of books, in a sea of all that's already out there, it's still so important to just push that green light and run with whatever is burning in your heart to do, because there's people out there that are going to resonate with what you uniquely bring. The next question that took me to, after I got past the why, was the how. And I just remember going, God, how am I supposed to get out what you have put on the inside of me? Nobody knew my name when I began. Nobody had heard of me. I didn't come from a family that everybody knew. You know, it was just seemed like ground level. I mean, just starting at square one. Maybe some of you find yourself in that same boat. You're thinking the market is so saturated. There's so many people. God, how am I going to do this? And again, that was a question that I just asked God. God, how is this? If you've called me to do this, I know there's a way, but what does that look like? How does this happen? And I remember that I felt like in my heart, that question got answered with a question. And the question that was asked of me was this: Jen, if you needed what I have given you to run with, how would you find you? And I remember thinking about that. And I just thought, I'm sure there's really probably some deep spiritual answer to that, but I don't think I know the answer, because honestly, all I'm thinking is I would Google it. I mean, isn't that how you get answers to questions in this day and age? Whether you're trying to find an answer to a fact or where to find information, most of us go to Google. And so I just remember saying, I don't know what the answer is, because honestly, all I'm thinking is I would Google it. And I remember the answer to that coming up in my heart, and it was exactly. And then I heard this: so position yourself in a way where you can be found by those that need what I've given you. Position yourself in a way where it can be found by those that I've called to receive from you. It made so much sense to me. And so I realized then there was a very practical path that I needed to walk in walking this out, in getting what I had to people who need it. And honestly, podcasting was one of those major essential tools of getting it out there for people to find it. That's what podcasting is for. It's not because, you know, people who podcast just have this big ego and they just want everybody to listen to them. It's not an ego thing. It's not an ambition thing. It really is a tool to be able to put out there what God has called you to do so that people who need it can find it. Once I got the why and the how answered, that was when I was really ready to go to work. So let's get into this. I want to help you position what God has given you in a way where it can be found. Let me give you some statistics about podcasts just to help you out. Because when I started podcasting, to be honest with you all, I did not listen to podcasts myself. In fact, I can remember my team coming to me and saying, hey, you know, let's think about doing a podcast. And I remember thinking, who even listens to those? Which is so purely showing how purely ignorant that I was. But it wasn't a medium that I had really connected to. So I want to just maybe put that out there and take the pressure off of you. Maybe some of you are like, Honestly, I watch videos on YouTube. I watch sermons online. Podcasting really hasn't been a part of my landscape. It doesn't have to be for you to launch one, but if you're heading that direction, I would encourage you to get into the podcast world. Start listening to them. Start paying attention to how people come at it. There's so many ways to do it. And so that could be something that would be a good stepping stone for you. But you don't already have to be really super involved in the podcast world to begin to look at launching one yourself. Let me give you some stats on podcasts. Listen to this. 50%, this is wild, 50% of all U.S. homes are podcast listeners. Over half of our nation now, and no doubt during this quarantine time, that percentage has drastically increased. That's actually over 60 million U.S. homes that connect to podcasts. Listen to this, worldwide, over 155 million people have listened to at least one podcast. And that number is growing really even daily. 16 million people consider themselves avid podcast fans. In other words, it's a part of what they do on a weekly basis. Like some of us watch TV shows, people are pulling up their favorite podcasts and listening to it. 49% of podcast listening is done at home. Isn't that interesting? 22% of podcast listening is done while driving. So these are things that you want to keep in mind as you're thinking about how you're going to craft and create your podcast. Podcast listeners listen to an average of seven different shows every week. Podcast listeners listen to an average of seven different shows every week. So what that means is someone might be listening to a podcast that sort of fits maybe who you are and what you called to bring. That doesn't mean they won't connect with yours. In fact, there's a good chance they'll just add it to what they listen to. Sort of like, back in the day when everybody had their favorite TV shows. If you liked one kind of TV show, chances are you'd probably like another TV show that was very similar to it. Podcasts are very much the same way. Okay, here's an interesting fact. The most popular podcast genres go as follows. The most popular, number one, is comedy podcast genres. Number two, educational podcasts. And number three, podcasts that are centered around the news. So number one is comedy. Number two is educational. It's how people are getting educated, how they're gaining new information, how they're choosing to grow. And then the next one is news, things that are keeping them up to date on current events. And here's another one. This is the last stat I'll give you. Podcast listeners are also social media users. 94% are active on both. So what that tells us right there is that those of you that are looking to do a podcast for the first time, in other words, this isn't those of you that have already launched a podcast, but you're thinking about doing this for the first time. You have this wonderful window of opportunity to make sure that when you launch that podcast on podcast platforms like iTunes and Google Play and Spotify, that you're making that very apparent on your social media. Because podcast listeners, 94% of them are also social media users. So you want the two, your podcast and your social media platforms, to sort of run in tandem. All right, let's get into actually how I craft and create a podcast. Now, this might be the portion that you really want to take some notes and just as I'm sharing these things, however it paints the picture for you, write that down, because this is really what's going to help you craft and create the podcast you're going to record. The first thing that I had to do before I sat down and recorded my first podcast was I had to ask myself two questions. And these two questions that I'm going to tell you I asked myself, I'm going to just tell you up front, they had two sets of answers. The first set of answers were the answers that I came to when I first started creating the podcast. But then the second set of answers came because the answers changed as I went. In other words, I answered these two questions one way when I started, but once I started doing it and I got some traction and I began to discover what really worked for me and hone it down, those answers began to shift. But as the saying goes, you have to start somewhere. So what are these two questions? The first question that I had to ask myself about this podcast was, what do I bring? In other words, a lot of times you hear it said this way: what is your secret sauce? What is unique to you? When I first asked myself that question, the answer to what do I bring to the table, or what is going to be unique that comes out of me, what is my sort of secret sauce, so to speak, the answer was simply this: it is that I awaken destiny. Now that can sound like a very big picture, ethereal thing to say, but what that actually looks like is my thing that I'm called to bring is to awaken the possibility of, inspire the potential of things that you were meant and designed to do. In other words, I don't want to just inspire you to reach just because it's an audacious or ambitious thing to do. I am called to inspire or awaken things in you that are in you because it's part of why you were born. So it carries with it sort of an innate sense of, this is the purpose why I'm here. And that's why I'm called to do that. That is what is all wrapped up when I say, I know that what I'm called to bring is to awaken destiny. And so because of that, when I started, everything that was tied to doing that sort of looked like me speaking to things of destiny and purpose, which is the main message that I typically am called to bring. How do you discover what that is for you? A couple of things that I tell people a lot is this. This is a wild scenario, but think about this. If I woke you up out of a dead sleep and put you in front of people and said, just encourage these people, what would be the first things that come out of you? If I woke you out of a dead sleep and put you in front of the clients you're trying to reach through your business, the people you're trying to reach through your ministry or your nonprofit, the people that you want to influence, what's the first thing that would come out of you? Would it be, here's how you need to fix things? Would it be an encouragement of, you can do this and here's why? What would you point people toward? Because if you'll make yourself answer that question, and honestly, it might be you need to get in front of a mirror or sit down and do a mock podcast and just go for it and see what just naturally starts coming out of you. Because the bottom line is, it will. Whatever is innately on the inside of you, it's like a river. It's like a well. When you start drawing on it, it's gonna come up out of you. So that's how you can get to that answer. What is your secret sauce, so to speak, or what do you bring? Keeping in mind that the answer you start with is probably not going to be the answer you discover as you go. It's going to get more fine-tuned. Then the second question that I had to ask myself after I asked, what do I bring, or what is my secret sauce? The second question I had to ask myself was, what does what I bring sound like and look like? Now, I know that's an interesting question to ask when you talk about doing an audio podcast, which most podcasts are. There are some podcasts that are video podcasts. Some people do both. Mine has always been audio, and I've kept it that way on purpose. I have visual content like with YouTube and videos that we post on Facebook and Instagram. But because there's still a good percentage of people that listen to podcasts while they're doing other things, like driving or commuting, or they're at home cleaning their house, or they're working on things and they're listening, I have decided to maintain that audio format. So it could be a strange question to ask, what does my secret sauce, or what I'm called to bring, look like and sound like? You still have to answer those questions. And the reason is, of course, with the sound like, there's actually options. So my first answer to that, what does it look and sound like? It actually started with the answer, it looks and sounds inspirational, because that sort of went with that, my secret sauce. It was to inspire or to awaken. And so what does that look like? Well, the look is, when you pull up the Jen Tringale Podcast, there's actually a graphic that represents it. In fact, we might even have that to be able to show you. And so I knew that that was going to have to be just plain, straight to the point. It was going to have to represent who I was and get straight to, this is this podcast and this is what it is. And so I think you have a shot of it there. It was just a side shot of me, the Jen Tringale Podcast, because when they listened to it for the first time, I wanted them to remember how to connect back to it again. Sometimes people will launch nonprofits or business ideas or even podcasts, and they'll come up with an inspirational name. There's nothing wrong with that. But here's what I would say to you about that. When you're creating what your podcast is going to look like, don't make it harder for people to remember or to rediscover than it has to be. For instance, maybe they're coming across me, Jen Tringale, for the first time. I don't want them to have to remember my name and an inspirational name of a podcast I made up. In other words, if I would have named my podcast Awakening Destiny Podcast, now to find my podcast again, they have to remember my name and the name of that podcast. I decided to just simplify it. So the look had to be straight to the point them to what I wanted to point them to, which was my name, and then make it simple, but have a feeling of inspiration about it. And so when we went to put all that together, those were the things that we were looking at. When we release new episodes, we're keeping that in mind. Whatever graphic we're going to create to represent the release of a new episode, we want it to be inspirational. We want it to be something that's going to point them back to what this podcast brings to them. So those were the two questions that I started with. What does it look, what do you bring? What's your secret sauce? And then what does what I bring sound like and look like? Now, when it came to sound, I discovered that in order for it to be inspirational, I did have to choose a sound. And that was going to require some things of me and my team. In order for it to inspire, it needed to be pointed in what it sounded like. For the first place I started with was, it needs to be consistent. What it sounds like, what it looks like needs to be consistent. And so I made a choice off the bat that I wanted it to sound very personal. I wanted it to sound like two people sitting down to have a conversation. And what I have to inspire you with is directly, uniquely personalized to you. And so what it sounded like had some audio choices attached to it. You can tweak that in how you record it and even how you edit it. But I would say that most of the podcasts that I'm drawn to, and probably the ones that are the most successful, do have sort of that personal quality attached to it. And I think that's really important. Okay, as I said, these questions that I asked myself, the answers evolved as I went. So I just told you the answers I started with. Here's the answers that I discovered as we grew in the podcast process. So I started with the answer, what do I bring? With I bring an awakening to destiny. The answer I discovered was that what I bring through the podcast is right on time words for what our listeners need in the moment. The Bible definition version of that calls it a word in due season. What I discovered as I went was it wasn't just a podcast tool to awaken or inspire things in people. What I discovered is that the secret sauce, or what I bring, is really to be inspired by heaven with the podcast that I release in the moment. So I didn't just sit down and say, well, I know I taught this that one time, maybe I'll share this on the podcast. It really came to sort of taking a pulse of what's going on in the world right now. The people that I'm called to affect, what are they encountering? What are they experiencing? Because most of that comes out of a ministry perspective for me rather than a business perspective. That didn't so much come out of what was happening in the culture as it did, what is God inspiring me to say? And that it would be a word in due season. I will say, for those of you that are involved in business and you are Christ followers, you know the Spirit of God lives in you, even through your business tools. I believe that your secret sauce is that God will inspire you about the content and the information that you need to release through your podcast at just the right time. And it will become a tool that becomes necessary to your listeners. I would say that that is probably the greatest piece of feedback that we've gotten over the last 2 years from our podcast listeners that listen from all over the world. We have listeners from 8 different countries. And that is, it's amazing to me that it's always what I need to hear right when I need to hear it. To me, that tells me that I'm hitting the mark because it's a word in due season. So that was the answer that I came to, that I discovered. And then the answer to the second question, what does it look and sound like? The answer that I discovered when I started with the answer being inspirational, the answer I discovered was relational. Because it was a word in due season, I realized that I didn't just want to be inspirational. I wanted it to be relational. I want to be able to become a part of the journey with you. If I'm going to put the time in to hear and believe that we're giving a word in due season, then I want that to establish a relationship where I consistently earn the right to speak into your journey and your path through that podcast. And so that affects a lot of things. It affects the frame of mind that I'm in when I go to record a podcast. It's not speaking to a large audience. It's not speaking to a large group. So my mindset is not just speaking to a crowd. My mindset when I go to record is speaking to an individual person. And that helps to bring that relational piece to it. How that looks then is images that represent the podcast have to match that personal touch. And we're really strategic about that and really guarding that and making sure that that stays consistent so that our listeners feel that consistency through everything that we put out, both audio and visually. So the bottom line is this, in these 2 questions that I'm telling you to consider, what does that look like for you? How are you going to discover yours? Remember what I said. If we woke you up out of a dead sleep and asked you to speak to a room full of your clients, people you feel called to affect, as you got started, what would just naturally come up out of you? Whatever that is, those are indicators of what it is that you are uniquely called to bring, or as we say, what is your secret sauce? Okay. I'm going to walk you through a couple of things that I think are really going to help you. First of all, I want to show you the equipment that I use to record the podcast. We keep it very simple. And the reason that we do is because many of you that listen to our podcast know that every month we release monthly, and we release 2 podcasts. One is a solo podcast, which is just me sharing that word in due season that God's dropped in my heart. The next one is actually a guest interview. And so the reason we keep our setup very simple is because a lot of times those guest interviews are happening when I'm on the road in conferences, or sometimes I'll fly into a city just to do a guest interview while I'm there for meetings or something else. So that setup of how we record has to be travel, easy, and then it also has to be simple to set up. And so you're going to get this in that PDF file that we're sending you, but this is the microphone that we use. It's an Apogee mic. It has great quality. I keep it about this far from me when I'm recording my solo podcast, and the gain, the volume is right there on the side, and I have that set about halfway up. And so what that does is when I record my podcast, it gives that very personal audio sound to it. But I can also set this up, like if I had a guest here, I could set it up right here, have that guest right next to me, and I'm still going to get a good quality sound as long as there's no ambient sound going on. That is really a big help when you're trying to grab on to that personal sound quality. As you can see, it comes with a little tripod, so you can just set that up on a table. You also have the ability to order a standing tripod on Amazon. You can connect that on there, but really I have found this little travel easy table tripod has been great. And then it just has one cord. It connects in the bottom of it. And then the other side of this cord has the UBS drive side to it. And it goes right into your laptop, computer. Of course, I do mine on a laptop. Now, some of you are asking, okay, what programs do you record into? All of that's going to be in your PDF file. And so we actually record right into GarageBand, save it in there, and then we do our editing in both GarageBand and Final Cut Pro. Again, all that info is going to be in your PDF that you're going to get. I'm going to just give you just a quick little snapshot into how I craft my podcast message or my recording when I do it. Because again, some of you are used to speaking in front of people, but here's what you're going to discover. You have to grow an entirely different communication muscle, so to speak, when you're sitting down to record a podcast into a microphone with nobody around. It's just you. In some ways, you would think that might be easier, but in a lot of ways, it's actually a little bit harder because there's nothing in the room that's coming back at you. And so even though you might have discovered the best ways that you communicate to a group of people, whether it be, employees, your business clients, or if you're a conference speaker, if you're a minister in churches, you develop that way, but doing the podcast version is a little bit different. And so what I discovered is this: you really have to plot out a little bit more what you're going to say and how you're going to say it. And you can't just type it out verbatim and read it, because you can tell that's what's happening when you're listening to the podcast recording. The other thing you need to do is take a drink of water before you podcast. Okay, here's what I found. I used to sit down to record my podcast and I would just have notes and I would just kind of jump from point to point, just like when I would stand up to speak at a conference. What I discovered, it was a little bit harder for me to do in recording. It made the editing process so long. I had a lot of ums. I had a lot of filler sentences as I was trying to figure out, what I was going to say next and how I was going to connect the 2 points. And it really made it hard. It was probably, I hate to say it, but it was probably about a year or so in that I just started going, this isn't working. There's got to be a better way. And then I got a creative idea. And the creative idea I got about how to lay out my message or my podcast recording of what I wanted to convey through that podcast was to storyboard it. Now, I've mentioned this before, but I'm actually going to show you all a picture of my storyboard for a podcast that I did called The Process of Possessing. Now, everybody is discovering right now in this moment that my handwriting is abysmal. I'm so sorry. But this will just give you an idea when I say that I storyboard my podcast, what it looks like. And while you're looking at this, I'm going to take a drink of water. Okay, so this is a podcast that I did called The Process of Possessing. Now, whether you have a business podcast or an inspirational podcast, whatever it is, this can help you so much. So when I say I storyboard it, as you can see, what I do is I draw out boxes. And those boxes represent different parts of the podcast that I'm going to work through. And I start out from left to right. I start at the top and I go down to the bottom. So I'll just walk you through this one as you're listening to it so that you can see why I chose to put those points in those boxes. I start out with my opener. When you go to record a podcast, you will be amazed how hard it is to think of different ways to opening a podcast. Because if you don't think it through, what happens is you just say the same things over and over, and it starts getting a little mundane and a little rote. So at this particular podcast recording, it was actually heading into holiday time. It was mid-November. And so my intro is that first box, and it says, welcome Thanksgiving, holiday season. And so I started out saying, welcome to the podcast. My name is Jen Tringale. As we all know, we're heading into the holiday season, and it's almost Thanksgiving. And so that just brought that personal element. And then I referenced that we're going into about a month of a holiday season. This moved me to my second box there, where then I began to reference that it was also coming to the end of a year, 2019. And so that took me to, it's not just a holiday season, but it's also a season to look at the end of the year for what God is saying. My third box there at the top then began to take me into my transition, which was as I began to look at the end of 2019 and what God is saying, it reminded me of something God had spoke to my heart. And so in that third box, I have written story of Jackson, Mississippi. That triggered my mind to remember that it was when I was in Jackson that the Lord spoke this phrase to my heart, you're in the process of possessing. So that's my framework that gives me the words that I'm going to say so that as I'm saying what I'm saying in the moment, I know where I'm going with it. And that's why storyboarding your podcast is so helpful, because you can visually look at where you're going so that you can take what you're saying in the moment in that direction. After I gave them that phrase, you're in the process of possessing, then that second round of boxes, it begins to show me where I'm heading next. Number one, that it's time to possess. And number two, that there is a process. And then from there, it's pretty self-explanatory. I went to my verse that I was going to share for that out of Isaiah 48. The process involves you and God. That's that third box on that second tier. And the process means that you are co-laborers with God, you're friends with God. Then that bottom line of boxes gave me my 3 points that I was speaking to. 3 things that the process of possessing takes. Number 1, courage of heart is in that box. Number 2, bold leaps of faith. And number 3, something that I call situational fortitude. So that is how I storyboard a podcast. And then as you'll see, that final box says the end. I always have written out what I am opening with and what I am ending with. Because when you're doing a podcast, and really even for communication, this is a really good point of reference for you. You think it's just going to come natural, but you need to think through what you're opening with and what you're ending with. You need to have a launch pad and you need to have a runway where you're going to land. My end on that was letting everyone know that we had just released our brand new website. We invested a lot of money and time in that. I wanted to make that available to them. And then I wanted them to know that arrow down points that there's free resources on that website, but there's also a 6-week study course that they could purchase if they wanted to get themselves ready for the new year. And then my last note on there was just to wish everyone a happy Thanksgiving. So as you can see, it's bullet pointed, but there's really not one piece that's left out. So that as I'm recording, what happens is it keeps you from adding a bunch of filler. It keeps you moving. And when you're listening to someone talk, that's what we're subconsciously listening for. Are you taking me somewhere? Is this stalled? And if it's stalled, people tend to push stop and say, oh, I'll finish it later. But if it's continually taking them somewhere, then their thought process is caught up with what you're saying, and they're not even thinking about, should I finish this later? because they're engrossed in going where you're taking them with the information you're giving them. I mentioned this on our Ahead of the Curve conference, that I was going to give this portion of the storyboard to you all that are a part of this. Because when I started using the storyboard method for mapping out my podcast, I actually didn't tell any of my team that I had switched how I was doing it. And when I made that switch and I sent them that raw footage, the editing team actually came back and said, we don't know what you did different, but editing this podcast took half the time that it normally does. That's when I knew that this storyboarding method was so very effective. And you'll be able to learn how to craft it for how it fits you best. But that is a huge map piece that I wish I would have had in the beginning. Okay, I'm going to start wrapping this portion up with giving you some ways to draw your podcast audience and to grow it. Here's number one, and you might want to write this down because it won't be in your PDF. Here's one of the biggest things you need to remember. Don't make it about you. Make it about your listeners. In other words, when I record a podcast, I make sure that I make them, my listeners, the focal point, because it is the focal point. It's not about you just got to hear what I have to say. It's not about me. It's not about what I'm going through. It's all about keys to help you. It's about helping you on your journey. It's about helping you be more successful and obedient to whatever God's called you to do, successful in your business and in what God's purposed you to do. But if I don't say that to them, then they might not know it. So that's why if you look at our podcast, I'll say, and we'll even describe it as keys to help you fill in the blank, ways to discover, fill in the blank. I'm doing that to let people know this podcast isn't about me. This podcast is for you and it's about you. My mentality when I'm doing that is simply this, and I really feel this way. I'm just the pipeline. It's not about me. It's about the quality of what's coming through this pipeline, helping you be what God's called you to be. And when I keep in mind that I'm just the pipe here, that the substance that comes through me is what is changing your life, which only comes from the kingdom of heaven, and that I just have to be a good carrier of that, it keeps the focus on the people that you're called to affect and not you. And that's really significant. And people can tell the difference. The second thing that's going to help you draw an audience and grow your audience is a commitment to excellence. I cannot stress this enough. In a sea of podcasts, it's the ones that are excellent that are going to grow an audience and are continually going to expand. What does that look like? First of all, a commitment to excellence means consistency. You need to decide and count the cost, what it's going to take to release your podcast on a consistent basis. And you need to be realistic about it. I release a podcast monthly and I release 2 every month. That's a lot for some people. My suggestion is to start out monthly. If you're concerned about that, then I would start out quarterly and move yourself up. I would not start a podcast and say, I'm going to release one every week. It's just not really realistic to be able to keep that up. But whatever you announce that you're going to do, be consistent at it. I cannot tell you with a traveling schedule, the lengths that we have gone to get out those 2 podcasts monthly. It's meant me coming off the road and recording in the middle of the night. It's meant my team having to go the extra mile to get things done. It's taken a lot, but it's our commitment to excellence and consistency that drove us to do that, and it matters. Okay, the next thing that speaks to a commitment to excellence is the time length. Listen, podcasts are being listened to. I would say that an individual, a solo podcast that you're just recording should be somewhere around 30 minutes. And an interview podcast should be probably somewhere no more than 55 minutes. The interviews that I've done that have gone over that, that's where we release it as a 2-parter. So keep that consistency in your time length. Be aware of time. Nobody wants to sit and listen to something really longer than that. That's about the time frame that will keep people's attention. Okay, also the audio quality. Again, you're going to get those equipment pieces in that PDF file so that you're going to know the mic, the distance, all of those things that you're going to need, and the programs to record it in. The next piece that's going to point to your commitment to excellence is visually. You guys saw my podcast graphic. Here's the main thing I can say about that. Keep the graphic that represents your podcast simple, and don't design it yourself. I'm going to say that again. Unless you went to school to be a graphic designer, or people pay you to design things because that's how good you are, and it's proven because people pay you to do it, do not design it yourself. And you say, well, how am I going to get it then? There's plenty of resources online that you can actually describe what you want, and people will design it for you for a very small fee. We can actually add some of those resources into that email that we send you. Usually people know someone that designs graphics, but don't design it yourself. Let someone design it for you, and keep it simple. You also saw the one that is designed for mine. It's one picture, it's one color. The logo is very clear. The font is very simple. Simple is much better. Okay, the next thing I can give you to keep your commitment to excellence is to decide you're going to grow as a communicator. And I'll be honest with you, the number one way you can do that is to listen to yourself. I know people say, I can't stand to listen to myself. But if you're not willing to do that, how are you going to be able to tell what you need to grow in? I make myself periodically go back and listen to myself. And I have always caught things that are things I need to work on. I've caught my go-to ums. I've caught my go-to words that I say, that doesn't even make sense. Why do I say that? I've caught inflections in my voice, and you hear things. Be willing to critique yourself. And the other thing I would say is ask people that are good communicators to critique you for you, and be willing to take it. Also, pay attention to people that are good communicators. Pay attention to what they do and they don't do. Be willing to grow as a communicator. If you do, it will help to increase your audience. Okay, another big piece of a commitment to excellence is your editing. When you record a podcast, it's never going to be perfect. You're going to need to edit out the noises, some dead space, the coughs. You're going to have to edit out the ums and the fill-ins. Again, the programs that you need for editing will be in that PDF. I know some of you are thinking, I don't have the time to edit. I don't even know how to do that. We're also going to give you an online resource of some places that you can actually upload the raw footage that you record, and they'll put in your intro and your outro for you, clean it up for a small fee. So that might be a good way for you to go. And then next, your commitment to excellence is going to be, like we started with, to position it in a way where it can be found. So getting it on iTunes and on Spotify through Google Play. There's ways that you need to describe what your podcast is and words to describe each episode that's going to make a difference in getting it positioned on those platforms. Again, that information is in your PDF so that you can go through it at your leisure. And then lastly, how do you hit the iTunes top list? Okay, when you launch your podcast, not many people know this, but when you launch your podcast, you need to release 2 to 5 episodes at the same time. You actually have to have multiple episodes for iTunes to even consider accepting you. So that's something that you need to take into consideration before you go to launch. You need to have 2 to 3 episodes recorded, edited, and ready to go. The second way that you can position yourself to hit the iTunes top list is to encourage people on your podcast and through your social media to subscribe to your podcast. Don't just listen to it, and to write a review on iTunes. This is a big indicator on which podcasts make those iTunes top list. So that's a big thing. Encourage people to subscribe and to write a review. Here's another way you can hit that iTunes top list. If you're going to do guest interviews, go after having guests that have a good following on social media that aren't already doing a lot of podcasts. If you'll grab on to guests like that, it's going to help you cross-contaminate. In other words, your audience will become their audience, but their audience will become your audience. And that's going to increase your podcast listening numbers. And that's what's going to elevate you and push your podcast up in those iTunes top podcasts lists. So be thinking about that as you're thinking people that you might want to have on as a guest. Another thing, we mentioned this a moment ago, name each episode that you release and write good descriptions and be specific. You can't just call it the same thing over and over. In fact, one good thing you could do, because my team is phenomenal at this, go back to my podcast episodes and read the title of each episode and read the description. It'll help you kind of get a frame of mind for what I'm talking about when I say you need to be specific. For instance, if we have on a guest, rather than just say, we're so excited, my podcast guest today is Amy Grant. What we did is we went on to say, we're having a podcast guest, Grammy award-winning artist, Amy Grant. She is a predominant women influencer of faith, and she's going to share with us, and then we lay it out. That is so pivotal in positioning your podcast, especially on iTunes. Okay, we're going to take some question and answer from you all. Hopefully, you have been writing some down. Listen, I know this is a lot of content and information coming at you, but what I believe this masterclass can do is help you to create a path forward, not only practically, but also creatively as you go to design and curate what your podcast is going to be like and sound like. And it is a work in progress. Hopefully these things will give you a road, a path that you can begin to move down in doing just that. So there's a chat feature there as you're watching. If you have questions, if you haven't submitted those yet, go ahead and do so. My team is sending me those. Right before I jump into these questions, I want to let you know about something that we have available for you. Last year, we opened up a mentoring connection. And this is something that I do one-on-one with clients. These are mentoring sessions that are geared toward leadership, mentoring sessions geared toward your calling, discovering your calling, fine-tuning your calling, and mentoring sessions that are geared toward helping you create or form the strategy for what God has called you to do. Leadership, calling, and creative. I would love the opportunity to get more hands-on with you in your path forward in stepping fully into whatever God has called you to do. And so if you've been looking for some help, some insight, being able to sit down with someone and just really map out what the path looks like for you, I would be thrilled to get on that journey with you. So that mentoring opportunity is available. It's on my website, jentringale.com. We're also going to be emailing you some information about that as well. All you'll have to do is click on the link. You can choose your time, get set up, and I would be thrilled to be a part of that journey with you. Honestly, in the last year and a half, it's probably one of my most fulfilling, exciting things that I get to do. I love the opportunity to get to know individuals and hear what God has put in their heart, find out where they're at in the journey right now, and help them take the next step forward. So if that's something you're interested in, I would love to be a part of that process with you. Okay, we're going to jump into your questions here. I know that you all have been sending some good ones, so let's jump in. The first one is this: how do you have a good balance in a podcast when there is more than one person talking or hosting a podcast? That is a great question. And honestly, it is a little bit of a dance, isn't it? Have you ever watched a TV show, or maybe you've listened to a podcast and you continually throughout audio, it feels like people are fighting for space? after a while, it gets frustrating. And actually, sometimes if I'm watching that or hearing that, it makes me nervous for the people. And it's really something you want to be aware of. I would say, first of all, if you're the host or if you have multiple hosts, this is something that you need to talk through. And it really boils down to communication styles. So if you have more than one host, what I would suggest that looks like is predetermine who's going to open with the first statement and who's going to respond. Who's going to initiate the first question? Who's going to initiate the follow-up question? Who's maybe going to run with the main point of that podcast? And who's going to comment on the main point made? If you can map that out, it will help you with more than one host. And then when it comes to just having a guest, what I discovered really helped me with not sort of stepping on the toes, speaking wise of my guests, is to get really pointed with your questions. In other words, don't just leave them general. Get very pointed. Know what your first couple of questions are and get right to it. And once you pose the question, go silent. Not everyone speaks as fast as someone else. Some people really think and process as they're answering. Don't let that get you nervous as a host. Just pull back and give them the space to respond. And let that evolve. Remember that you can always take out dead space in editing, but there's not a whole lot you can do with people talking over top of each other. So that is something that you just learn as you go. But if you're going to have an excellent podcast, it's something that you want to have an ear to. So whoever asked that question, it shows me right off the bat, the fact that you were thinking that way already tells me that you have an ear pointed for excellence, because you're wanting to make sure that there's clarity in what's being communicated. And that is a goal worth seeking out. So that's a great question. Okay, here's the next one. How would you approach a podcast differently that is taken from a weekly sermon, like a church podcast versus an individual podcast? This is really good. We actually have done this a couple of times, very rarely. Usually my individual podcast is me sitting down and recording it. Every once in a while, if there's something that I just really feel came from a conference or a message I shared that needs to go out on the podcast, the way that I do that is I sit down and I record a personal introduction to that podcast. And I sort of lay out why I feel like it's important, what I believe it will speak to them, and then I will make a statement like this. So let's go right into this message as I share, and then I'll give the name of that message, and then we'll bring in the audio of that message that I preached, or like the message that you as a pastor preached. And then I'll do an outro. In other words, I'll record that intro, and then I'll record an outro that we're going to put after they hear the message. And I'll say something like, I hope that was a word that spoke to your heart. And then I'll make some comments about that message that I shared. And then sometimes I'll pray, or I'll point them to another resource that will kind of take them to the next level. That way it keeps that personal, individualized feel to it, even though we're sharing something that was shared, to an audience. That should help stabilize that word. Okay, here is our next question. How do you formulate questions for your guests? Okay, I'm really going to have to pull back the curtain on my process here on this. And great question for whoever asked that. How do you formulate questions? As the podcast host, this is very unique to each person because we're all wired differently. And you need to be able to have an honest assessment of yourself to find out where your strengths lie. For me, when I go to interview a guest, and more times than not, I don't know the guest real well personally. We probably have met somewhere along the way, but we haven't spent gobs of time together. So I don't know them real well. But what I do for me is I actually like most of the interview to naturally evolve. In other words, I do not storyboard out a guest interview. I don't have every single question pre-formulated. I typically start out with 2, because whatever they bring up, the guest meaning, as the interview begins, whatever they say in answer to those first 2 questions, that's what I allow to dictate where the rest of that interview goes. But you have to be wired that way. In other words, I just realized that I just sort of had a sense inside of me as they were sharing to know, okay, what's that piece they just said? That's interesting. Let's go more that direction. Which also brings me to a really good point. When you're interviewing someone, and you would think this just goes without saying, but it doesn't, you have to actually be listening to your guest. You have to get so tunnel vision, because your head is wanting to go, what am I going to say next? Is the audio working? Is everything okay? I hope nobody walks in the door. You know, you have all these things that are trying to transpire in your head, but you really have to shut that out and just stop and listen, and really listen with your heart to what your guest is saying. Even if you're doing a podcast for business purposes or to reach more clients, listen to what your guest is saying, because if you'll listen, the best direction that conversation needs to go is locked up in what they're saying. Now, every now and then you're going to have a guest that's having a hard time finding words. That's where you want to have those couple of questions tucked in that you can pull out and help pull out of them what's on the inside of them. Now, if you're getting ready to do a guest interview that you're really nervous about, okay, and you're thinking, I hope I don't choke, I hope I don't run out of stuff to say, then you might want to go into that interview with maybe 4 or 5 questions rather than a couple. But we all know that the best stuff comes out when you just let it naturally happen. And so that's how I formulate my guest interviews. Okay. Is there a right or wrong way to invite guests? Friendly version versus formal letter, especially with prominent influencers? Man, what a great question. Okay, here's what I would say about that. I think you need to have both ways available. For instance, when I first started doing guest interviews, a lot of them came from in the moment. Because I was on the road, I was in different conferences, I would get to know another speaker or maybe the conference host, and it would occur to me, this would be a great podcast conversation. I traveled with my mic and my laptop with me, and so I would in the moment say, hey, I have a podcast, I do a guest interview every month, and I would love to have you on my podcast. Would you be open to sitting down while we're here together and recording an interview? It was so easy. That's how it happened. No formalities involved. And I would always say this. And hey, if it's just not your thing, no pressure, because you don't want to pressure somebody into doing that. But that's really how it began. So that was the friendly version. If it was something that I had a friendship with, then I would just text them or make a call and reach out and say, hey, I'd love to have you on the podcast. Would you be open to that? Again, no pressure. For guests that you don't have a connection to, and maybe it's a bit of a reach, you absolutely need to do it in a professional manner. And here's what that looks like. If it's someone of prominence that you want to reach out to, first you need to find out, do I email them directly, or do they have a manager or an office, maybe an administrative assistant, that's who I need to talk to? Whichever version that is, then you need to craft an email. And the email would say something like this. Hello, so-and-so. I want to introduce myself. My name is Jen Tringale, and I host a monthly podcast. This podcast is geared toward, and then you would say what your podcast is geared toward. And I am very interested in having you as a guest on my podcast. I think you would be a wonderful contribution to the podcast because of your ability to speak to, and then you would say that. And then you would say this: if this is something that you are open to doing, would you please respond to this email, let me know, and then we will go from there in setting this up at your convenience. That way they let you know that you let them know you're not fly by night, that you're doing things professionally. And honestly, that adds a bit of security. I think if you'll do that this way, you'll be surprised at the responses that you get. Now, I will say this: people are very busy, and depending on the level of the influence the person that you're trying to get has, it may take more than one ask. You might have to send that email multiple times, and you don't have to be confrontational about it. You might wait a week, 2 weeks, and then say, hey, we sent an email last week. Everybody's busy. Just circling back around on this. Want to see if this is an opportunity that we could make happen. And then reattach your original email. Stay kind, stay compassionate, stay professional. And I think you'll be surprised at the yeses that you will get. So I hope that is a help. Okay, I know we're probably only going to be able to take just a few more here, but hopefully we'll get them all in. Okay, next question is, have you ever been turned down by a potential guest that you really wanted to have on your podcast? If so, did you ever try following up or reaching out at another time? No, we've never been turned down. No, that's not true. Yeah, we have been turned down. And to be honest with you, there can be a lot of different reasons. Here's one thing you need to know. Some people just aren't comfortable with being interviewed, even when what they do is public. For some people, the whole idea of being interviewed, they have to work through that. So sometimes you're going to get a hesitation or even a flat no, just because it's not something that they're comfortable doing. Sometimes, and a lot of times, it's a scheduling thing, or they're just not that familiar with you. And so they're a little hesitant to put themselves into sort of your arena until they find out a little bit more about you. One thing that you could do to offset that, maybe you get a response back and they say, oh, it's just not going to work at this time, or thanks for asking, or maybe you don't get a response at all. A good thing that you can do is follow up with a little bit more background information about yourself. And you could say, hey, just to maybe give you some more information of who we are or what I do, here is my website, here is my social media, here's some guests that we've interviewed in the past. That is a really great way to give a guest a security that this person is professional in what they're doing. I'm not going to be asked some questions I don't want to be asked. Maybe even send them a link to a guest interview you've done in the past. Anything you can do to secure them and make them feel comfortable with who you are and what you do is always going to help. If you get a response that's just a flat no, then what you could do is say, thank you so much for getting back to me. Always respond with kindness. Thank you so much for getting back to me. We may check back with you at another time to see if there's an availability there. If so, we would love the opportunity should that open up. And then I would say give it maybe 3 months, even 4 months. And if it's a guest you really want, circle back. I would say if you get 2 flat no's in a row, let it go. There's plenty of wonderful guests out there that will fit exactly what you're trying to convey and be a benefit to what you're saying. If they're just consistently coming back a couple of times and saying no, I would say just let that go and go find the yes that's waiting for you. I think that will really help. Okay, here's our next question. Do you sort of coach the guest before the podcast, as in tell them what your questions will be and share things to calm the guest? If so, how much ahead of time should you send your questions? Great question there. I have never pre-sent questions. I've never been asked, even with some of our highest profile guests. Like I said, we've had Grammy winners. I've had Double Word winners. I have people that are on national television. None of them have ever asked for questions ahead of time. If they did, I wouldn't have had a problem with it. We would have just had to really sit down and go, okay, what do I really want to ask this person? But because the majority of that comes in the moment, I don't usually have those ahead of time. As I mentioned, because I open my podcast guest with a few get to know you personal questions, that's what, when we sit down and we exchange pleasantries and, connect for a moment, that's when I'll say, okay, now the way I normally do my podcast is I'll introduce you. I'll thank you for being on the show. And then I'll say, typically we'd like to ask our guest a few get to know you questions. These are just for fun. And so I tell the guests in advance, I'm going to ask you, what's your go-to Starbucks drink? What's something that you're using right now, a product or something that maybe it's a new app, maybe it's a new piece of technology. If I have a woman, I'll say, what's a go-to makeup product you're loving? Maybe a supplement somebody's taking, just to share. That's really been a great piece that people have loved listening to. And then I'll let them know. And then my last question is, what's a book you are reading or have read that's just made a great impact on you? It could be anything. And so what that does is it gives the guest an opportunity to start sharing out of themselves, where they don't have to dig really deep. They don't have to think really hard. And I'll give them some time in the moment to think through, what those answers are going to be. And then what I have tucked in my mind is, after those 3 questions are asked, I have that first question tucked in my mind for what direction I'm going to take the podcast. That just kind of gives me a launch pad to start. And then I think the rest of that question was, do you share things to calm the guest and tell them exactly how it's going to be? Sometimes what I'll do is, the only thing I'll say beyond that is, if the guest is coming on and they just released a book, or maybe they just released a new album, then of course I will have read that book. I will have recently listened to that album, and I'll reference something that they have put out to let them know I have done my due diligence to know who they are and what they are saying. So, for instance, we had a Grammy Award-winning guest on, Ashley Cleveland. She had just written a book right before I did the interview, called Little Black Sheep. I bought that book and I read that book before I did the interview. We've had some musical artists, some Dove Award winners on. I know who they are in a general sense before the interview. I got on iTunes and I listened through their music, where they started, where they are now. I'm not going to tell you I spent hours and hours, but I make sure that I am acquainted with who this person is, and even who this person is recently, because whatever they've most recently done is what they're going to want to talk about. And that's going to give you a whole lot to work from in that guest interview. If you have a business podcast, look and see what your person is recently doing, projects they're involved in right before you sit down to interview them, because that's what's going to pop to the top in them that they are going to want to talk about. And I'll tell you the truth, it's a lot of fun. It's a whole lot of fun to sit down and do a little bit of research into somebody's world that you're getting ready to have a conversation with. Go to their social media, go to their website, get to know a little bit about who you're sitting down with, and pull out of that. And it will make a really big difference. Okay, next question. How do you record and do a phone interview podcast? Okay, this is a great question. This is just me. I really do not like doing guest interviews that aren't in person. Now, I have more of an ability to make the one-on-one happen because of traveling a lot with my itinerating schedule. So that's not the norm for most people. The answer is, can you do them, through technology? Yes, people do them all the time and it works. So the best ways that you can do an interview over the phone is through Skype. I've done them through Skype. We did a interview with a podcast guest. She had just released a brand new book. Her name's Patsy Caminetti. She's in Australia. As much as I'd love to go to Australia to interview Patsy Caminetti, we did that over Skype. You can also do it through Zoom, which is how you are watching this masterclass. You can do it through Zoom, and you can edit the audio from the file that you record. So that's how you would do that. So a lot of people do that. I have a friend that does loads of podcast guest interviews. She's been on my podcast multiple times. My dear friend, photographer Michelle Mitchell. Most of her podcasts are done over Zoom or Skype. And so it works. It's proven to work. You can do it. So either Skype or Zoom, those are the two ways that I would suggest doing those. Okay, how should we use tags in the descriptions in our podcast? In other words, using your branding buzzwords. You should absolutely do this. So whenever you post on your social media about your podcast, you should always have like those same hashtags that you're using. If you go and look at mine, usually we do hashtag purpose, hashtag destiny, hashtag strategy, and we always put those on there because it does lend to all those algorithms and everything that's swirling out there for who sees what. So as far as getting the word out on your podcast, the two biggest things that I would say to you is, number one, through your social media, your Facebook, your Instagram, Twitter. Number two is through your email database. So you need to be able to capture emails, have a database where every time you release a podcast, you send out that email saying, we just released a new podcast on this with this guest, or this is what I spoke to. And I would highly, highly suggest that you format those emails. This isn't just an email you type. Those of you that have subscribed to my podcast, you know this. You'll get an email from me. It has a header on it. It has a message. It'll tell you the podcast coming out, what it's about, who's on it. There'll be links there where you can listen to it. You can set up those emails through services like MailChimp. You can set up those emails through Constant Contact. You can format those, put your picture in there. It might take a little bit of time to work with it, but it, again, adds to that commitment to excellence and consistency in getting those out. So I hope that helps. Okay, this might be the last one. Let me know how many more we can take, team there. Okay, do you utilize a producer for each episode? And if so, can you explain their role? That's a great question. So the answer to that is no and yes. The initial answer is, when I first started, I really operated as a one-woman show for a really long time. So everything I was self-producing. I self-produced all my social media. I self-produced all my graphics. I self-edited all my messages, all the editing that got done. I did it all because this essentially was what I was sowing my life's energies into doing. And starting out, you don't really have a budget to hire people to do these things for you or even farm it out. And so I just threw myself into the deep end. Things that I knew was above my head, I couldn't figure out. I called in every favor that I had. If I had friends that knew stuff that I needed, I was like, can you just help me get this started? Can you come over here and show me how to do it? If I knew, like, some teenagers or 20-year-olds that were super savvy at something I knew I didn't know how to do, I was like, look, I need you to help me out. I called in every favor that I had. So when I started, everything was self-produced. As I continued to grow, then I did move over to where the podcast is produced by someone else other than me. Mainly because of being on the road all the time, I wouldn't have the time to do it anyway. And so as far as the creating of the podcast, I shared with you my process, the storyboarding, the content, what that's going to be, what I'm going to share in that podcast. When I do a guest interview, all those interviews generate with me. I decide who I'm going to have on. I decide what I want to talk about. I decide when I'm going to release what guest interviews and what all that looks like. So all of those decisions are me, but the editing, the formatting of that, all of that is produced by people other than myself. So once I record that raw footage, the raw audio file, or I do the guest interview, then I use a service called WeTransfer. A lot of people use that, or you can use Dropbox. And I simply email that audio file out of GarageBand to the people that are going to edit that, put the intro, the outro on it, clean it all up, and then they actually submit it to our platforms of Google Play and iTunes and Spotify for that podcast to be there. So if that's something that you're interested in, maybe paying somebody a little bit of money monthly to get all that going for you, you absolutely can do it. But you can also jump in the deep end and say, you know what, I'm going to have to learn how this works. So you just have to see where you're at and what works for you. And I just have to say that my team and our producers on this podcast are phenomenal. They do an absolute incredible job. That is spearheaded. Most of you know my project manager, Kara, who is no doubt wondering what else I'm going to say, but she does a phenomenal job. Our team they really do great work. And I'm so blessed by all of them. They really do a great job. Okay. Last question. If you want to answer it, I mean, they set me up here. I'm the women's leader at church. What is your advice for starting a podcast under the approval of my senior leaders? Well, I think that's a great idea. I mean, here's what I would say to you. If you're wanting to do a podcast, you need to decide right now, is this something you're wanting to do individually that just represents you? If you're wanting to do a podcast that represents the company you work for, the church you work for, or the ministry that you oversee as a volunteer, then you need to get approval for that, because you can't launch something that partly represents something you represent without their approval. If it's something that's just purely you, whether it's, something you want to inspire people to do, if it's your business, if it's your nonprofit, if it's your ministry, then you can go for it. But if it's a ministry that you oversee connected to a church or another nonprofit or another business, then you absolutely have to get approval for that. And be willing to not just say, hi, I want to do this, can I? But bring them sort of a plan for what you want it to be, how you want it to reach people, what you want it to speak to. Give that leader or that department head or that CEO sort of a blueprint for why you're wanting to do this, and let them know how that podcast can create a wider audience for what that business or that church is called to do and who they're trying to reach. I think if you'll create the synergy between the two, then you're more prone to get a yes from them than not. I really want to tie this up with just one last final thought, and that is this. I cannot encourage you enough that when you're doing this, to be yourself, be genuine, be authentic. When you are even speaking, listening to someone speak, just audio, you can tell when their thoughts are in what they're doing in the moment. You can tell when what they're saying is coming from something they've experienced, they've walked through, or is genuinely on the inside of their heart. You can tell when someone is simply sort of reading a script or phoning it in. And podcasts can be such a powerful tool, especially in speaking to people's hearts. And so even if you're doing this from a business sense, from a service you want to provide, or from a ministry sense, I just would really encourage you to think through how you can do it genuinely from your heart. And if your goal is to help other people put their best foot forward, then that authenticity is going to come out of you. And that is what's going to create a listenership, an audience for people to come back to you again and again, because what they're getting from you is valuable. Yes, you want it to be professional, you want it to be executed well, but you want it to be real and genuine. And you can do that, but you might just have to pause and make sure that that's the place you're doing it from. If you'll do that, I think you're going to find that resonating that we talked about happening. There's people out there who need who you are and what you have to carry and the way you have to carry it. So let everything that comes out of you genuinely come from the core of who you are, and that resonating dynamic that God so powerfully makes happen will take place. I hope this has been just a great help to you. Just want to remind you that you're going to get that PDF with all of those resources, all the places that we go to get all the components that we need to make this podcast. I am giving it to you. And so if you have some questions after that, maybe reach out to me on social media. Let me know. If you want to take part in that mentorship program, whether it's for leadership, for stepping into your calling, if it's for finding your creative path, creating a strategy for what you're trying to launch or take to the next level, I would just love to be a part of that journey. It's a part of my heart. It's a grace that God's put on my life. And I would love to spend some time with you and be a part of that process with you. So check that out. That mentoring is available on my website, jentringale.com. You're also going to get a direct link to get more info and even schedule your first mentoring session in that email that we send you. If there's anything else we can do to be a help to you in this launching process, let us know. Shoot us an email back. Let us know how this was a help, how it was effective, maybe some things you were still looking for that maybe we didn't touch upon. Hey, I'm not saying we have all the answers, but if we do, we're certainly ready to make it available to you. Thank you so much for taking your time to invest in this masterclass and to be a part of this. Thanks for sending in your questions. I look forward to how we can connect and help you advance in the future. Have a great week, everybody, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye. Maybe you're looking to take some next steps in what God has called you to do or lead. Maybe there's a need for clarity, for definition of what comes next for you. I would like to invite you to consider an opportunity to be a part of the mentoring and coaching program that we launched just a few months ago. It's been amazing to see the strides that people have taken all over the country, men and women that are leading in significant ways. This whole program has been designed with one thing in mind, and that's you. Please check out the information. If this could be a part of your journey, I would love the opportunity to do that.